Greetings to Beneros. So, let's again address the Syrian hypocrisy filling the Western media. I know I touched on this not too long ago, and my voice is like the proverbial tree falling in the forest with its unheard noise. But the laws of physics dictate that the vibration of matter do produce sound particles, so maybe if I make enough racket, a few of those particles might actually echo somewhere. Anyway, according to the New York Times of June 21st, 2012, CIA officers are semi-secretly operating in southern Turkey, coordinating and deciding which of the Syrian freedom fighters deserve assistance. They allegedly are trying to cut out Islamist jihadi groups, but the Syrian Muslim Brotherhood is a vital instrument in this arms smuggling ring. Turkey, Saudi Arabia, and Qatar are the regional cutouts for this operation. This sounds like a rerun of Afghanistan in the 80s. You can just smell Reagan's hair pomade on the breeze over the Pamirs. The Syrian National Council is coordinating the local rebel groups and military defectors under its umbrella of the Free Syrian Army. The FSA's main recruiting ground outside Syria are the lightly guarded refugee camps across the Turkish border, which begs the question of a vested interest in producing more refugees and therefore more troops. An unnamed Arab intelligence officer with regular American contacts is quoted as saying, CIA officers are there and they are trying to make new sources and recruit people. The weapons being supplied include automatic rifles, rocket-propelled grenades, all with ammunition, of course, and anti-tank weaponry. The U.S. is also considering additional rebel assistance, like providing satellite imagery and other detailed intelligence on Syrian troop locations and movements, which is diplomatese for saying that they are already doing so. The whole modus operandi in arming the rebels is not so much to bring peace, freedom, democracy, and human rights to Syria, a good place to choke, but in the Times' words, to force Mr. Assad from power. Let the chips and body parts fall where they may. That the majority of Syrians do not want a civil war is naturally irrelevant to those who claim the unilateral right to speak for the Syrian people, especially when they are not Syrian, or if so, do not live in the country. The Syrian majority do want democratic reform, but through the ballot, not the bullet. That has been the traditional goal of Western-sponsored democracy movements, but after Iraq and Libya, the West has grown used to the taste of other people's blood. Oil is at stake here too, unlike in the Ukraine. The struggle in the country is increasingly divided along secular communal lines. One is an enemy for these reasons, not one's attitude to democracy, because support or not for the regime has often depended on these community factors. Secular Syrians and Syrian Christians are afraid of the rise of the Muslim Brotherhood, for instance. Many actively look to the Assad government as their last hope of protection. That part will not figure in Hillary Clinton's plans to free the Syrian people. These plans revolve around the fomenting and use of a well-subsidized violent minority. Intoxicated by their success in Libya, the Syrian National Council and NATO are determined for a Libya too. The Syrian exiles hope to use regional allies and NATO to put themselves in power, while NATO wants to create another satellite regime in the region, which just so happens to be a major oil supplier and Russian ally. The great game is not dead. And those of you who are blind to this are idiots, or most likely know what's really at stake, but prefer to cover your asses in the blood of civil war. But Syria is not a backwater like Libya, but rather a populated regional power. A civil war in Syria will not only be a major catastrophe for its people, but a source of destabilization for the entire region. But that's okay. It's only the little people who will suffer on the ground, the kind who are always marginal to Western corporate concepts of freedom, democracy, and human rights. But how can I be so callous over the slaughter of thousands of innocent people by the Assad regime? In the first place, we don't know how many people are actually being killed, nor how many are truly innocent by any meaningful definition of the word. Our main sources come by feeds from the Syrian opposition, funneled unquestioningly to the Western media through the partisan Avaz fundraising organization, all of whom have proven every bit as untrustworthy and disingenuous as the Ba'ath Ministry of Information. The SNC and FSA have every reason to jack up the body count, like the Kosovo Liberation Army of a decade ago, remember them? While the Syrian state has every interest in minimizing it. The real truth, as much as we can know of it, is best exemplified in one recent incident. In Triamsa, a Syrian village northwest of the city of Hama, itself a hotbed of the Muslim Brotherhood, with a strong desire for revenge for the crushing of their 1982 rebellion by Assad Sr. In this village, some 200 innocent people were allegedly massacred in cold blood, according to the usual Syrian rebel sources. But according to United Nations observers allowed into Syria, as reported by the Wall Street Journal, it's now revealed the killings were not deliberate targeting of civilians, but in the context of a raid to arrest male rebels. Men in arms, in other words, not innocent old folks, babies, or budding unveiled young girls yearning for Western cosmetics. This is the truth behind the disingenuous human rights trope peddled by opposition leaders and their Western allied governments. Things are bad, but not to the point of deliberate genocide perpetrated by a blood-crazed regime and its inhuman tyrant. When targeted civilian casualties do occur, they are sectarian in nature, not so much regime-based, and are a direct result of creating civil society through fomenting civil war. But, Azov, how can you advocate freedom and democracy and human rights by trashing it in Syria just because you don't like the political forces stirring things up there? Well, I don't trash those values at all. That's a dishonest response typical of those who can't make an argument themselves and have to distort to the point of others to have one for their own case, and symptomatic of the sheer hypocrisy surrounding this issue. To be fair, the equation of the West equaling democracy and pro-Western forces equaling the democratic opposition are the standard mantra of the official media. Knee-jerk reactions on the part of the general public to crises like Syria are somewhat understandable. But remember this, human rights liberals, the next time you guffaw at Glenn Beck or snicker at Sarah Palin. Freedom and democracy, human rights, on an individual and social basis are as necessary in Syria as anywhere else. The Syrian people do have real grievances against the Ba'ath government. Their desire to participate in the Arab Spring of 2011 was cut down with live ammunition. This kind of response always leaves hate and bitterness behind, and the desire for revenge. And now you know why totalitarian states do not allow even peaceful protests, so they won't have to take these kinds of discrediting measures, because things can get out of hand when irate people present their grievances to authorities, who have no real desire to resolve them, like in downtown Manhattan and Washington. The Syrian people, the real ones, that live there, have every right to change their regime if they desire and discuss among themselves the various options for doing so. These Syrian people also include those who identify with or cling to the Ba'ath Party and its government. This is all reminiscent of the Reagan era, when the United States was itself on the other side of wars of national liberation. People like Hillary Clinton haven't forgotten places like El Salvador. They bank on young tweeters and Facebookers not knowing about that ancient history while peddling the imperial snake oil of humanitarian intervention from the free market halls of Congress. Besides, that was the Cold War, and things were different then. Well, inconvenient old farts like me haven't forgotten, and things were not so different. That is, if human rights and freedom and democracy are the universal moral absolutes which apply in all circumstances. Way back yonder in those olden days, a Central American spring was wafting across the hemisphere back in the late 70s. The Sandinista rebels overthrew Anastasio Somoza Jr. in Nicaragua with Cuban coordination, while neighboring El Salvador was ruled by a U.S. allied military regime determined to crush any sign of democracy as Soviet-Cuban communist insurgency, which meant that those frustrated by unsuccessful attempts at peaceful change turned to armed struggle as their only option for survival. Through Cuba, the Salvadoran opposition was coordinated into the Revolutionary Democratic Front and also supplied its armed force to the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front. Whatever the hopes and fears of the Salvadoran people, they were caught up in a network of violent geopolitics, having to choose sides between an unbending regime armed to the teeth by the United States, a regime that did not hesitate to use the grossest terror and torture, and massacred innocent villagers on more than one occasion, up to 10,000 people in the 1980s, in a country of 3 million. With Syria's 22 million people, the Syrian government will have to reach a figure of 75,000 to begin to compare. Or they could side with a guerrilla insurgency armed by the Soviet bloc and its regional allies, Cuba and Nicaragua. There was even a version of Avaz, a public money laundering, a fundraising organization called CISPAs, Citizens in Support of the People of El Salvador, whose members and contributors were put on FBI watch lists. You can bet the contributors to Avaz don't have to look over their shoulders because their relationship to official power is quite different. So, yes, things might have been different in those Cold War days after all. And they are not in Hillary Clinton's favor. In fact, compared to her, Fidel Castro and Leonid Brezhnev, even in his last days of senility, looked like mature, rational, and ethical world heads of state. Because there was no suggestion that Soviet or Cuban armed forces would intervene to stop the massacre and bloodshed of innocent Salvadoran civilians. There was every humanitarian reason to do so, as much as in Syria now, and no legal prohibition against it. The Monroe Doctrine didn't apply to Cuba, nor the Charter of the Organization of American States, which forbids one OAS member from direct attack on another member state. Cuba was kicked out of the OAS in 1961 at U.S. demand, and the U.S. violated the OAS Charter anyway in 1965, sending Marines to intervene into the Dominican Republics. Civil unrest, putting a right-wing politician in power for 30 years, and exiling the leader of the real democratic opposition. No, there was certainly no compelling legal or moral constraints stopping Castro from sending the Cuban armed forces directly into El Salvador and coordinating with the Salvadoran rebels or putting them into power. Of course, the reaction of the U.S. would have been so hysterical as to risk World War III. And that's just it. There is no longer any need of realpolitik, let alone real standards of humanity and decency. There is no counterforce to stop imperial adventurers from doing whatever in the hell they decide to do with other people's nations and those people living in them. So, you want me to put the interests of the suffering Syrian people first before all the geopolitical babble? Fine. I'll support the Free Syrian Army and its sponsors and the right of Saudi Arabia and the U.S. to arm them and even directly intervene to end the bloodshed of the regime by bringing peace through war. If you'll concede that the USSR and Cuba had the moral right to intervene in the massacre and bloodshed of El Salvador a generation ago by subsidizing the Farabundo Martí National Liberation Front and putting the boots of the Revolutionary Armed Forces of Cuba on the Atlantic beaches of Central America. Let's not forget Guatemala. Of course, such a concession will come easily and cheaply. That's all history. The people involved are long dead or retired. But I'd just like to hear you paragons of political virtue say it, just to show your logic and values stand on real moral high ground and not upon geopolitical bullshit. Well, I know that's not Syrian girl partisan on this line. Hello? Hey, you do speak excellent English. Why is that? Oh, it's Anastasio Somoza Jr. You were sitting around in hell playing pinochle with Muammar Gaddafi and just want to say your piece about regime changes? That the outside powers it's no more than changing dirty underwear. Well, maybe. But if guys like you wouldn't sit on demands for democracy, maybe also you wouldn't get yourself so nasty. I mean, when it's time to go, it's time to go. And you know, great powers are the mommies of the world, dosing out milk and magnesia to people across the globe, just like Hillary Clinton used to do to Chelsea back in the White House. It's good for them. Well, maybe not quite like that. After all, if you overdose them to the point of tearing their guts out, they can't do shit about anything ever again.